remember the first time I drove into Plainfield, Wisconsin. The highway stretched out in front of me like an endless gray ribbon, lined with bare trees that seemed to whisper in the cold October wind. It was supposed to be just another assignment for the Crime House Halloween special to launch our new show, Crimes of. But the deeper I drove into the town that once called Ed Gein a neighbor, the more I realized this wouldn't be an ordinary crime story. It was about fear, the kind that lingers in the air decades after the headlines fade. Plainfield was small, almost hauntingly quiet. A few gas stations, a diner, a thrift store, and streets so empty it felt like time had stopped. I parked near the old town center, a few miles from where Gein's farmhouse once stood before it was burned to the ground. Locals still don't like to talk about him, and I could feel that silence everywhere. It wasn't denial, it was protection. People here had spent years trying to move on from the horror that began in their own backyard. I checked into a modest roadside motel where the owner, an elderly man with kind eyes, immediately guessed why I was there. "Halloween season brings folks like you," he said, sliding the key across the counter. "Just don't go asking too many questions. Some wounds never close." I nodded, but curiosity is what brought me here, and I wasn't planning on leaving with half a story. That night, I sat on the bed with my recorder, taking notes. I had read all the files, police reports, and articles about Gein's crimes, but something about being there made the details heavier. It wasn't just the facts, it was the space itself, the stillness that made me imagine what life must have been like when Ed was just another quiet face in this town. He shopped at the local hardware store, chatted with clerks, and even helped neighbors with odd jobs. Nobody saw the darkness inside him. That was the most unsettling part. The next morning, I drove down to the outskirts of where his farm used to be. There's nothing left now, just open fields and a faint gravel path leading to nowhere. I got out of the car and stood there, letting the silence settle. The air was crisp, carrying that faint earthy smell of harvested soil. Somewhere in that soil, history had been buried and unearthed in the worst possible way. Standing there, I thought about how evil rarely announces itself. It often grows quietly, in the corners of ordinary lives, in homes where something has gone terribly wrong. Gein wasn't a myth or a movie villain. He was real, a product of isolation, trauma, and unchecked madness. I realized that telling his story wasn't about glorifying him. It was about understanding how something so horrifying could take root in such a peaceful town. As I drove back toward the motel, the sun dipped below the trees, turning the sky a deep orange. Halloween was only days away, and I could already sense the irony. The world dresses up as monsters for fun, never realizing how close some of them once lived to home. I had come here to record a story for our show, but what I found felt more like a warning. Plainfield had learned the hard way that true horror doesn't come from the shadows, it grows quietly in plain sight. When I started digging into Ed Gein's childhood, I expected to find a rough upbringing, maybe some neglect, some early signs of mental instability. What I found was worse. His story read like a psychological case study in how a person can be shaped, warped, and ultimately destroyed by their environment. Every detail of his early life pointed toward a slow, inevitable descent into madness. Ed was born in 1906 in La Crosse, Wisconsin, but his family moved to a small farmhouse in Plainfield when he was still a boy. The move wasn't for opportunity, it was isolation by design. His mother, Augusta Gein, wanted to keep her sons Ed and his older brother Henry away from what she called the filth of the world. She was a religious fanatic who preached that women were instruments of sin, that the world outside their farm was corrupt, and that purity could only be found in obedience to God and to her. Every sermon she gave carved fear and guilt deeper into Ed's mind. His father, George, was an alcoholic who worked odd jobs, but never held anything steady. The few people who remembered him described a man beaten down by life and by his wife's control. In the Gein household, there was no warmth, no laughter, no normal sense of family. Meals were eaten in silence while Augusta lectured her sons on the evils of temptation. The boys weren't allowed to have friends. They didn't go to town unless it was necessary. Their mother's word was law, and Ed worshipped her as much as he feared her.
Growing up under that kind of pressure does something to a person's mind. The world becomes divided into holy and evil, and there's no middle ground. For Ed, his mother wasn't just a parent, she was a godlike figure. When she punished him, it wasn't cruelty, it was salvation. When she condemned women as wicked, he believed her. Even after he grew into adulthood, her voice stayed lodged in his thoughts, echoing every time he felt desire, shame, or confusion. Psychologists later said that Ed developed what's known as a dependent personality, meaning he couldn't make decisions without external control. His entire identity revolved around pleasing his mother. When she died in 1945, that fragile structure shattered. For Ed, her death wasn't just a loss, it was the end of his world. He boarded up her room like a shrine and left it untouched for years. He lived in the rest of the house surrounded by filth, rotting food, and silence. Alone, unmoored, and consumed by grief, he started slipping into delusion. But the seeds of what came later, the grave robbing, the skin suits, the obsession with death, were planted long before Augusta died. They grew in that farmhouse, in the darkness of her sermons and the isolation she forced upon her children. What began as strict moral control twisted into a warped fascination with the human body and mortality itself. Ed's understanding of death became inseparable from his longing for his mother. Standing in front of that empty field where the Gein farm once stood, I couldn't help thinking how predictable it all felt. Every choice Augusta made created the man Ed became. And that's the most terrifying part. Monsters like Ed Gein aren't born out of nowhere. They're built slowly, painfully, the hands of those who believe they're doing what's right. By the time Mary Hogan vanished in 1954, Plainfield was the kind of town where everyone still left their doors unlocked. People knew each other by name, gossip spread faster than news, and anything out of place was noticed right away. Mary ran a small tavern on the edge of town, a no-frills bar with a jukebox, a handful of regulars, and her unmistakable laugh that could cut through the smoke and chatter. She was bold, loud, and full of life, which made her disappearance all the more unsettling. One night, she was serving beers. The next morning, she was gone. I remember reading the original police report. It said there was blood on the floor behind the bar and a single bullet casing nearby. Nobody, no weapon, just a trail that led nowhere. Locals whispered about it for weeks. Some thought she'd skipped town. Others suspected foul play, but no one dared to think someone like Ed Gein could be involved. He was the quiet handyman who helped neighbors fix fences and shovel snow. Harmless, even helpful. When he mentioned Mary's disappearance in conversation, he'd say strange things like, "She's not missing, just not around." And people would chuckle awkwardly, assuming it was his odd sense of humor. In small towns, there's a kind of blindness that comes with familiarity. You trust the faces you see every day, even when they say something that doesn't sit right. Ed was one of those faces. People pitied him after his mother died. He was lonely, odd, but never threatening. No one wanted to believe he was capable of violence. It's easier to believe the monster lives somewhere else. It wasn't until 3 years later, in 1957, that Mary Hogan's name resurfaced most horrifyingly. That fall, another local woman, Bernice Worden, disappeared from her hardware store. The evidence this time was clear, a receipt with Ed's name on it, found near an empty cash register smeared with blood. When police searched his farmhouse, what they found didn't just solve Bernice's case. It revealed the truth about Mary Hogan and much more. But before that revelation, the town lived with unanswered questions. I spoke with an older resident who remembered the night Mary went missing. She told me, "We thought the worst thing that could happen here was a snowstorm. We didn't have words for the kind of evil that was coming." That sentence stuck with me. It captured how unprepared people were for the darkness that had been growing right under their noses. Looking back, Mary's disappearance marked the beginning of Plainfield's unraveling. It was the first crack in the illusion of safety, the first sign that something unimaginable was living among them. The tragedy wasn't just in what Ed did, it was in how long no one saw it coming. People joked about him, pitied him, and ignored his strangeness, and in doing so, they missed the warning signs that might have saved lives. When I stood in front of where Mary's tavern once stood, now replaced by a quiet parking lot, I tried to picture that night, the laughter, the clinking glasses, the sudden silence. It's eerie to think that one man's delusion could erase someone so full of life and leave a community permanently changed. Plainfield would never be the same after Mary Hogan disappeared. It was the moment when innocence ended and horror quietly stepped into town. The search of Ed Gein's farmhouse in November 1957 remains one of the most horrifying crime scene discoveries in American history. When Sheriff Art Schley and his deputies arrived at the property, they were expecting to question Ed about Bernice Worden's disappearance. They had no idea they were about to uncover something that would scar every man on that investigation for life. It was a cold, gray afternoon when they pulled up the dirt road to the Gein farm. The house looked abandoned, dark windows, a sagging porch, and piles of junk scattered across the yard. There was no movement inside, no sound except the crunch of boots on frozen ground. One officer went around to the shed, flashlight in hand, and that's where he found her Bernice Worden's body, hanging upside down, gutted like an animal. It was so shocking that several officers stumbled outside to vomit. They thought they were looking for a missing person. What they found was a nightmare. As they moved through the house, the horror deepened with every step. The smell hit first decay, rot, and something chemical like old leather and disinfectant. Flashlights swept across walls and furniture, and the beam caught things that didn't make sense at first. Bowls made from skulls, chairs upholstered with human skin, boxes filled with bones, and masks' literal faces carefully preserved intact to the wall. One investigator said later it didn't feel like a crime scene. It felt like walking into a haunted museum made by someone who had completely lost his grasp on reality. But amid the revulsion came an important shift in how crimes like this were investigated. Up until that point, small-town police forces weren't trained for cases involving psychological derangement or ritualistic behavior. Forensics in the 1950s was basic fingerprints, blood typing, and photography. There was no psychological profiling, no standardized method for cataloging such extreme evidence. The Gein case forced law enforcement to face something new, a crime born not out of greed or anger, but delusion and obsession. The Wisconsin State Crime Laboratory was brought in to handle evidence, and for the first time, investigators began documenting a killer's environment as a window into his mind. They took detailed photographs of every object, every arrangement. Psychologists were called to examine what these artifacts revealed about Ed's mental state. His house wasn't just a scene, it was a map of his madness. Everything he made from human remains pointed to a longing for control, identity, and his dead mother's presence. It was both terrifying and tragic. Standing there years later, with only an empty field left where the farmhouse once stood, I tried to imagine what that night must have been like for those officers. Most of them were local men, the kind who had handled bar fights and missing livestock, not mass graves. Some of them never worked in law enforcement again. One, I learned, retired early and refused to speak about what he'd seen for the rest of his life. What we often overlook in these stories is how moments like that change not just the town, but the people who have to face the evidence. That farmhouse became a turning point in American criminal investigation. It pushed authorities and psychiatrists to start working together, laying the groundwork for modern criminal profiling. Out of one of the darkest crimes in history came a painful lesson. Understanding evil requires more than punishment, it requires studying the mind behind it. When the farmhouse was eventually burned down by locals, it wasn't just about destroying a building. It was an act of exorcism. Plainfield wanted to erase the horror, but history has a way of lingering. Even now, decades later, people still drive past that empty field and shiver, remembering what was found inside that house and how it forever changed the way we see the human capacity for madness. Understanding Ed Gein's psychology is like staring into a broken mirror. Every reflection reveals another fragment of pain, obsession, and delusion. When I began reading through his psychiatric evaluations and police interviews, I wasn't just trying to learn what he did, but why. The more I studied his mind, the clearer it became that Ed wasn't a monster in the conventional sense. He was a man whose reality had shattered so completely that his crimes became an attempt to rebuild it. After his arrest, psychiatrists quickly realized they weren't dealing with a calculating killer. Gein wasn't motivated by greed, hatred, or even thrill. His crimes were ritualistic, rooted in deep psychosis and an obsessive attachment to his deceased mother, Augusta. He was diagnosed with chronic schizophrenia, severe mental disorder that distorts perception, emotion, and reasoning. But his condition was more complex than any label could capture. Ed lived in a world that blurred the line between life and death. After Augusta's passing, he withdrew entirely, surviving off odd jobs and government checks. The loneliness consumed him. He began visiting local cemeteries at night, digging up the graves of women who reminded him of his mother. He claimed he would fall into a kind of trance and later barely remember what he'd done. To him, death wasn't an end. It was a doorway through which he could keep his mother close. What he did with those bodies was horrific, but it also revealed the depth of his delusion. He fashioned masks and suits from human skin, reportedly wearing them in his home to feel like a woman, more specifically, to feel like her. To most people, that's unspeakable. To Ed, it was grief made tangible. In his mind, he wasn't desecrating the dead, he was trying to resurrect love, identity, and connection in the only way his fractured mind could comprehend. During questioning, Gein's tone was eerily calm, even polite. He didn't seem to grasp the enormity of his actions. Psychiatrists noted that he showed no true understanding of guilt or consequence. It wasn't that he didn't care, he simply didn't live in the same moral universe as everyone else. His world was governed by hallucinations, religious delusions, and memories of his mother's dominance. That combination created a psychological storm few could fully untangle. One expert described him as a man who lived at the crossroads of madness and devotion. I found that phrase painfully accurate. His crimes weren't expressions of evil in the traditional sense, they were the product of untreated illness and decades of emotional control. In another time, with intervention and mental health care, Ed might have been institutionalized long before anyone was hurt. Instead, he was left to spiral in isolation until his fantasies became real. It's easy to label him a monster because it distances us from the truth, but the educational takeaway here is unsettling. People like Ed don't appear from nowhere. They're created through neglect, trauma, and mental illness left to fester. His case became a cornerstone in discussions about criminal insanity and competency. It forced psychologists and courts to recognize that some crimes are not driven by intent, but by illness. Standing at the site where his home once stood, I couldn't shake that thought. Every horror film inspired by him, Psycho, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the Silence of the Lambs turns his madness into spectacle. But the real story isn't about terror. It's about what happens when society fails to see the warning signs in time. Gein's life is a dark reminder that untreated minds can become prisons and, sometimes, graveyards. When Ed Gein finally stood before the law, it wasn't the kind of trial the public expected. The country wanted a monster to condemn, but what they got was a deeply disturbed man who barely understood what was happening to him. The court proceedings revealed as much about how society viewed mental illness as they did about Gein's crimes. It became a landmark case, not because of its verdict, but because it forced the justice system to confront a question that still lingers today. What does justice mean when the killer is insane? After his arrest, Gein was initially charged with the murder of Bernice Worden, but his confessions linked him to far more than one death. The evidence what investigators found inside his farmhouse was overwhelming. Yet from the beginning, his demeanor confused everyone. He didn't act like a murderer. He was soft-spoken, almost childlike, answering questions with eerie politeness. When prosecutors read the inventory of body parts found in his home, he didn't react with shame or denial. He seemed detached, as if the events belonged to someone else. His defense attorney requested a psychiatric evaluation, and the results were unanimous. Ed Gein was legally insane. He suffered from chronic schizophrenia, was incapable of understanding the moral weight of his actions, and lived in a delusional world dominated by hallucinations and the ghost of his mother. In legal terms, this meant he couldn't be held fully responsible. In human terms, it meant that the justice system had no easy place for him. The trial was brief, just 1 week in November 1968, after more than a decade in psychiatric custody. The judge ruled that Gein was not guilty by reason of insanity and committed him indefinitely to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Waupun, Wisconsin. To some, that ruling felt like mercy. To others, it felt like an injustice. The public wanted punishment, but psychiatry demanded treatment. The case split the country's conscience. As I went through old newspaper clippings, it was striking how the headlines reflected society's discomfort. Some called him the Butcher of Plainfield. Others painted him as a tragic figure, a madman lost to grief. Few knew how to reconcile both truths, that he was both victim and villain. Reporters described the courtroom as silent when the verdict was read, not out of shock, but uncertainty. How do you feel closure when the man responsible doesn't even comprehend guilt? During his years in the hospital, Gein was described as a model patient. Nurses said he was polite, cooperative, and quiet. He worked in the kitchen, read magazines, and occasionally watched television. He never showed aggression. It was as if the world of Plainfield and the horrors of his farmhouse existed in a completely separate universe from the man they now cared for. When he died in 1984, at the age of 77, he was buried next to his mother in an unmarked grave, the final act of a life consumed by her shadow. But beyond the morbid details, Ed Gein's trial became a case study in the ethics of punishment. It asked the courts to balance compassion with accountability. The insanity defense, already controversial, became a subject of national debate. Should mental illness excuse a person from punishment? Or should it change the way we define punishment altogether? Standing in the courthouse archives, I found myself reflecting on that tension. The easy answer is to call people like Gein monsters, to box their actions away as something other than human. But the harder truth is that mental illness doesn't erase humanity, it complicates it. His crimes remind us that justice isn't always about vengeance. Sometimes, it's about understanding how far the mind can fall when no one intervenes. In the end, the Ed Gein trial was less about closing a case and more about opening a conversation, one that the legal and mental health systems are still having decades later. When Hollywood discovered the story of Ed Gein, it didn't just find material for one movie, it found a blueprint for an entire genre. His crimes were so grotesque, so far removed from ordinary understanding, that filmmakers turned them into modern myths. What started as a true story about mental illness, isolation, and obsession became the foundation for some of the most iconic horror villains of all time. But as I researched how those films came to be, I couldn't help noticing how much of the truth got lost between fact and fiction. The first major film to draw from Gein's story was Psycho 1960. Alfred Hitchcock never used Ed's name, but the parallels were unmistakable. Norman Bates, the shy motel owner obsessed with his dead mother, was a mirror image of Gein's fractured psyche. The idea of a man preserving his mother's corpse and assuming her identity came straight from the psychological horror that Plainfield had already lived through. Yet Psycho turned the darkness into something stylish, cinematic, and strangely fascinating. People left theaters terrified but entertained. It was the first sign that the real horror of Ed Gein had been repackaged into something audiences could consume safely from their seats. Then came the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 1974, which took inspiration from Gein's House of Horrors. The skin furniture, the bone decor, the rural isolation, all of it echoed what investigators found in that farmhouse. But unlike Psycho, this film didn't hide behind subtlety. It threw viewers straight into chaos and brutality. Leatherface, the killer who wore masks made of human skin, was the monstrous embodiment of Gein's most infamous acts. Yet again, the movie turned terror into legend. It was shocking, but not instructive. The story stopped being about mental illness and became about fear itself. Even The Silence of the Lambs 1991 borrowed elements from Gein's life. Buffalo Bill's woman's suit, stitched together from victim's skin, was lifted directly from his crimes. But in that movie, the focus shifted to psychology, with characters like Hannibal Lecter representing intellect and evil intertwined. The irony was striking. Real-life Ed Gein, who could barely hold a conversation without stumbling, had inspired one of the most eloquent villains in film history. As I watched these movies for my research, I realized how pop culture has a way of transforming real pain into spectacle. The victims, women like Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden, became footnotes in a narrative dominated by fictional killers. The human tragedy, the societal failures that allowed Gein to spiral unnoticed, faded into the background. What remained was the thrill, the myth, the entertainment. I don't think filmmakers intended harm. They were exploring fear, pushing boundaries, and reflecting the darkness of human imagination. But every retelling distanced audiences further from the truth. The Ed Gein of history was not a brilliant predator or cunning mastermind. He was a lonely, mentally ill man trapped in delusion. The true horror wasn't his violence, it was the neglect that let him reach that point. Still, Hollywood's fascination with him changed horror storytelling forever. The killer next door, the quiet man hiding monstrous secrets, became a cultural archetype. Viewers could no longer look at small towns or lonely strangers the same way. Gein's legacy became more than his crimes, it became a lens through which we explore our collective fear of what people are capable of. When I left the small theater in Madison where Psycho had first premiered in Wisconsin decades ago, I thought about the strange loop between fiction and reality. Hollywood took Plainfield's darkest chapter and turned it into an art form. And in doing so, it reminded, sometimes without meaning, that the scariest stories on screen often begin with a real person no one bothered to help. One of the most striking aspects of the Ed Gein case was how the media covered it and how that coverage shaped public perception of crime for decades to come. In the 1950s, newspapers were the primary source of news, and small-town reporting was often sensational, designed to capture readers' attention while glossing over nuance. Gein's arrest and the horrors discovered in his farmhouse became a national story almost overnight, and the reporting set a template for the modern fascination with true crime. I spent hours going through old clippings and radio transcripts from that period. The headlines were dramatic, almost theatrical. Madman of Plainfield. Killer makes art of human flesh. Grisly secrets in quiet town. Every article focused on shock value, emphasizing the grotesque details: the skulls, the masks, the furniture made from human remains, while largely ignoring the psychological and social context that led to these crimes. It was horror journalism before the term even existed. What struck me most was how the reporting amplified fear, not understanding. Readers across the country were terrified, imagining that monsters like Gein could be lurking in their own communities. And in many ways, that fear was exactly what newspapers wanted to generate. The more horrifying the story, the more people bought the paper, tuned into the radio, and remembered the town's name. Plainfield became synonymous with terror, its residents burdened with the infamy for decades. Yet the media coverage had another effect, one I found particularly instructive. By focusing on the gruesome artifacts, the storytelling turned Gein into a caricature, half man, half monster. The reality was far more complex. He was mentally ill, deeply lonely, and profoundly influenced by a traumatic upbringing. These nuances were drowned out by the frenzy over shock and sensationalism. In a sense, the reporting itself became a second kind of horror: the fear of misunderstanding, of labeling a human being as something monstrous rather than broken. The influence of that coverage also spilled over into the emerging culture of true crime. Radio shows, later television documentaries, and eventually podcasts adopted the same approach, highlighting the macabre and shocking while often skipping the lessons or context behind the crimes. Ed Gein's story became the blueprint for stories where fear takes center stage, leaving critical thinking and empathy behind. During my visit to Plainfield, I spoke with some older residents who remembered how people outside the town reacted. They told me families would avoid passing through, and children would be warned about the madman down the road. Fear became part of the town's identity, imposed not just by the events themselves, but by how the media chose to present them. For decades, Plainfield was seen as a place where evil could spring from anywhere, a reputation that outlasted even the memory of Gein himself. This historical reflection offers an important lesson for us today. Media shapes perception, sometimes in ways that obscure truth and humanity. Sensationalism sells, but it also simplifies complex realities into narratives of fear and horror. Understanding Ed Gein requires more than just recounting the grotesque. It requires questioning how society interprets and broadcasts such stories, and how that framing can perpetuate myths, misunderstandings, and stigma. In the end, the media didn't just tell the story of Ed Gein, they helped create the cultural monster that lives in our imagination today. The headlines may have faded, but the lessons about responsible reporting, empathy, and context remain as vital as ever. Reflecting on the Ed Gein case, it becomes clear that the real lessons go beyond horror and sensationalism. Behind the headlines and the gruesome artifacts lies a story about how communities, families, and society at large can fail to intervene when warning signs appear. Visiting Plainfield and speaking with historians, law enforcement veterans, and locals, I began to see that understanding this case required more than fascination. It required reflection on prevention and responsibility. One of the first things I learned is how isolation contributed to Gein's descent. After his mother died in 1945, Ed had no social support system. He was cut off from meaningful relationships, lacked mental health resources, and lived alone in a rural environment where neighbors noticed oddities but did enter could and act on them. Early intervention, even in the form of community attention or mental health services, might have prevented the escalation of his obsessions into murder. His case is a stark reminder that mental illness cannot be ignored. particularly in isolated settings. Another lesson comes from the patterns of neglect within his family. Augusta Gein's extreme control and the way she demonized women shaped Ed's worldview in a profoundly destructive way. Her death left him unmoored, and the absence of guidance or support allowed his delusions to dominate. It's a tragic illustration of how childhood trauma, abuse, and unchecked psychological manipulation can have long-term consequences. Recognizing these patterns early is essential to preventing future tragedies. There's also a societal lesson in how the small-town culture contributed to the situation. In communities like Plainfield, privacy and autonomy are valued, sometimes to the point of ignoring problems. Neighbors noticed Ed's eccentricities but didn't intervene, partly out of respect, partly out of discomfort. Fear of confrontation or lack of awareness about mental illness can create conditions where dangerous behaviors go unchecked. It's a cautionary tale about the need for vigilance, community support, and education. From a broader perspective, Ed Gein's story teaches us about the intersection of crime and mental health. Modern psychiatry, social services, and law enforcement protocols have evolved to identify and respond to warning signs in ways that didn't exist in the 1940s and 50s. Crisis intervention, counseling, and early psychiatric evaluation can save lives, not just potential victims, but individuals like Ed himself, who was trapped in his delusions for decades. Understanding these lessons highlights why education, awareness, and proactive care are crucial in preventing such tragedies. Finally, the case emphasizes empathy and judgment. It's easy to label Ed Gein a monster and forget the human factors that created him. Recognizing the societal, familial, and psychological failures that contributed to his actions doesn't excuse them, it informs a more compassionate, preventative approach. We learn that neglect, abuse, and isolation can breed horror, but that awareness and intervention can make a real difference. Standing on the empty field where his farmhouse once stood, I realized that these lessons weren't abstract. They were tangible. Plainfield had survived, but the story of Ed Gein remains a warning. The scariest horrors aren't just in fiction, they're in the failures we overlook in real life. Communities, families, and systems all bear responsibility to notice, intervene, and care. If those lessons are ignored, history has a way of repeating itself. By the time I reached the site of the old Gein farmhouse for the final part of my research, I understood that the story of Ed Gein was more than a true crime, it was a confrontation with real horror, the kind that lives in silence and neglect rather than in movies. Standing in the open field where his home once stood, I thought about the people whose lives had been destroyed, the lessons that had been ignored, and how horror had been sanitized by pop culture. The final lesson is about perspective, recognizing that the most terrifying monsters often emerge not from fiction, but from a combination of isolation, trauma, and untreated mental illness. When we study cases like Gein's, it's easy to focus solely on the grotesque artifacts, the murders, and the sensational details. But to truly understand, we must also look at the societal failures, the missed warnings, and the human factors that allowed his obsessions to escalate into murder. It's a sobering reminder that evil isn't always obvious. Sometimes it grows quietly, in ordinary places, until it explodes into tragedy. I reflected on how his crimes affected Plainfield for decades. The town's identity became entwined with fear and infamy. Families moved away, children were warned about strangers, and the shadow of Gein's actions hung over the community long after the house was burned down. It's a testament to how trauma doesn't just impact immediate victims, it ripples outward, shaping communities and collective memory. The town's efforts to rebuild and reclaim its identity were as much about healing as they were about erasing the horror. But the lessons remain for anyone willing to see them. There's also a cultural lesson. Hollywood and the media have transformed Gein's crimes into myths, horror films, and legends. While those stories entertain, they often obscure the real lessons: neglect, isolation, mental illness, and societal failure. True horror isn't just the spectacle, it's the context that allows it to exist. Understanding that helps us confront real-world dangers in a more informed, compassionate way. Most importantly, the Ed Gein story serves as a warning and a call to action. It reminds us to pay attention to the warning signs, to intervene when someone is clearly struggling, and to support mental health and social connections before isolation and trauma can fester. It's a lesson that goes beyond fear. It's about responsibility, awareness, and the collective role we play in preventing tragedy. As I stood there, listening to the wind sweep across the empty field, I realized the real horror wasn't the masks, the bones, or even the murders. It was the way society allowed a man to spiral into this darkness unchecked. That truth is far scarier than any Hollywood villain, and it's the reason Ed Gein's story continues to resonate decades later. It's a story that asks us to look beyond shock and sensationalism, to face the uncomfortable reality that real-life horror often begins in silence, isolation, and neglect. Standing in the quiet fields of Plainfield, long after the farmhouse had been burned and the headlines faded, I realized the story of Ed Gein is more than a tale of murder and grotesque obsession. It's a mirror held up to human frailty, societal neglect, and the consequences of untreated trauma. From his childhood under an oppressive, fanatical mother to the shocking discoveries in his home, each chapter of his life reveals how isolation, abuse, and mental illness can create conditions for tragedy. The horror we remember, masks made of human skin, bodies hidden in the farmhouse, the bizarre rituals, was only the surface. Beneath it lies a sobering lesson about the importance of community, empathy, and mental health awareness. Gein's crimes weren't born from inherent evil. They were the culmination of warning signs ignored, support systems absent, and trauma left unchecked. Hollywood may have transformed him into a cultural icon of terror, from Norman Bates to Leatherface, but the reality is far more unsettling. True horror is not always cinematic. It is human, messy, and rooted in neglect. It lives in the silence of a community that looks away, in the isolation of a mind left untreated, and in the moments society fails to intervene. Ultimately, the Ed Gein story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. That monsters can live among us, that trauma can fester unnoticed, and that prevention through awareness, mental health support, and compassion is more powerful than punishment. Standing in that empty field, I understood that the legacy of Plainfield's most infamous resident is not just horror, it's a warning. Real monsters exist, but they thrive where society fails to act. And understanding that, more than any mask or horror story, is the lesson that lasts.